Yeah, thank you very much, Mick, and thank you also for the acknowledgement of country that we had at the start of our session, and we certainly echo those sentiments as well. My name is Garrick Fields, and as Mick said, I work in solutions for the industrial water and mining for Black and Veatch. And we have an hour today for this really exciting discussion, and so I encourage you to get comfortable, and we are going to dive deep into some of these really interesting subjects. Each of our panel members are dealing with or have dealt with issues surrounding sustainable water management and water stewardship in mining or its downstream industries. Now, I know that this will be a session filled with valuable insights as they share their experience with us. They are also empowered not just to answer my questions, but to have a conversation amongst ourselves. And so we want this session to be interactive among us and to really unpack some questions and some answers as well. In 2010, the United Nations formally recognized access to safe water as a human right, fundamental to health, dignity, and prosperity. The collective drive towards achievement of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals has seen governments and industry respond through reducing water consumption, improving recycling practices and technologies, investment into sustainable water infrastructure, and improved policy and regulation. But such adaptation is, of course, not uniform or ubiquitous. There are pockets of excellence as much as there are jurisdictions and sectors that might be lagging behind, and the mining industry is no exception. In general, mining has seen an increased focus on water stewardship and sustainable water management in existing operations, new projects, and downstream industries too. The International Council for Mining and Metals, ICMM, and the Alliance for Water Stewardship define the use of water the sustainable use of water to be socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial. And it's achieved through a stakeholder inclusive process that involves both site and catchment level actions. And so that brings us to our first question, and I'm going to give this one to Blair. Now, when we think about those drivers and the key components of that definition, when we think about sustainable water management and water stewardship, Blair, how have the appetites and drivers and outcomes evolved in the mining and metals industries over the last decade?
Yeah, thank you, Garrick. Can you hear me okay? Good. I've been fortunate enough to be involved with this transition for the last 10 to 15 years with, I guess, the theme of water stewardship, mainly from a technical perspective, but set the journey that BHP went on probably about 12, 15 years ago. In a mining company's perspective of water stewardship does need to be clarified. It's a very generic word. It's similar to ESG. You know, these are sort of ill-defined. You sort of come up with how you see them and how you characterise them. But for someone like us, we see it as we need to understand our impacts and our effects on a catchment scale. That's collected impacts on environment, environmental values, cultural heritage and its values, other users and community, not only within our mine gate, but proportionally on a cumulative impact perspective. You need to know that. If you shoot past that too early, you sort of run the risk of the virtue signalling. And so that started our journey. But with that becomes the engagement, the collaboration, really important words, the meaningful collaboration. And I'll talk about that in a bit, how we've learnt what meaningful collaboration is. Because currently, you know, we are learning some hard lessons through engaging at the right time and accepting that we need to give space to traditional owners about how they can work with us and we work with them, and that we understand them. So it's that collaboration to come and find solutions. Now, you're not always going to find solutions in water stewardship which are perfect for everyone. There's a compromise. Don't think we're in some fantasy world here where we've all got to still mine to make money. The third part, which is really important for water stewardship, is the disclosure and the disclosure of information which is relevant to the risk that we face. And along with that comes this advocacy. So there's no point in sort of working up water stewardship if you don't have this advocacy, going out and talking about the positive things that you're trying to do as well as the challenges. But specifically to your question, sorry, I'll drone on a bit here. The journey we've been on that 10 years, it's really started, I think we've mentioned a number of times, we started 10 to 15 years, regulatory conditions drove us. Subsequent to that, we had pressure from NGOs to disclose. And on the back of the NGOs, we also saw shareholder and equity market pressures as well. And some of those were well-intentioned, but also directed us towards things which weren't necessarily relevant for all the sites. And one of the things in particular was disclose your water use data, which is great for somewhere like the Escondida example that Brady spoke about, and thanks for the plug on that one, appreciate that. But there's also the areas where you have significant water challenges associated with flooding, too much dewatering, where you have the opposite effect. And so disclosing water based on water use and efficiency doesn't always translate to what your challenges are. So therefore we had to get ahead of that, and because the share market was sort of pushing us on this, wanted traffic lights on how we're performing with water efficiency and called it stewardship. And so the ICMM and the Mining Council of Australia and got together with us all, and we had a great 5 to 10 years coming up with consistent methodologies on reporting, consistent methodologies on communicating these issues and getting ahead of the curve, which really drove us towards what we call outcome-based conditions and driving towards context-based conditions. So for every site we've got, we want to disclose. We'll disclose based on what is the risk, what is the issues that are facing the broader catchment, and not just water use, but things like, in this particular case, we're pumping too much groundwater. There could be impacts to the environment. So what do we do? The condition there, or context-based target for us, would be to put it back in the ground and offset impacts. So that sort of took us to this sort of catchment scale approach to water management. And with that, setting ourselves these targets which are based on conditions relevant to the site, engaging the local communities and understanding what they want, and then putting forward, a position which we can then report on each year in our own terms, but also report on where need be through the ICMM formats. But one thing I would say is that these sort of things are really hard to do. And I don't think the mining industry has actually achieved these proactive water management, water stewardship initiatives just yet. I think we pretend we have. And when you look forward, even the case that Brady spoke about with us at Escondida, great outcome, okay? We've moved towards desalination. We've taken the pressure off the aquifers, but it came at a time when we're under pressure to do so. So it wasn't something we just decided, hey, tomorrow we're going to do it, because we end up having to spend a lot more money per kilotonne for water supply. So I'd argue that we're not quite at that proactive stage yet. We're still reactive.
Thanks, Blair. I'll extend that question along the panel and with regards to how we've seen appetites and drivers and outcomes evolve over the last decade or so.
Obviously, I think Blair covered off on a lot of it, but I think if we look at it from a water sector lens, I think we've seen a huge shift in how we look holistically at water and the social and environmental value of water as opposed to just the economic value. And I think I'm back. So one of the things we've been looking at is how do we partner with First Nations communities differently, and I'll share a little bit on one of those models today. But also, how do we consider different ways to stop that long-term environmental impact? And there's a lot of scientific evidence about in certain instances. A lot examples. There's also a lot of examples from a perspective of the cultural. So we're spending a lot of time with elders up in the Pilbara, and the stories they tell about the watering holes where they used to swim and they used to fish that they haven't seen for 30, 40, 45 years because of some of the impacts that we've had as an industry in some of these regions. So we need to look at the scientific data, but also the personal stories and value those from the First Nations communities.
And can you hear me? Yeah, that's better. And I think be responsive to it is the key. There's no doubt, what's changed. The climate's changed. So what was sustainable abstractions in many jurisdictions no longer perhaps is. And, these are long life operations that are having these impacts. And so I'm here representing the Environmental Protection Authority for Western Australia, and certainly we can take action as government, but I actually don't think you want that. I think really what we were looking for is industry to be responsive around, when there is a change, to not wait for your next approval to be the time to do that, to be responsive as and when it occurs, so that we avoid, that outrage situation that can quite easily result.
I would say if we're talking about drivers, what we've seen in the last 10 years would be, at the beginning of that decade, a big focus on disclosures and investors calling for disclosures and transparency. And so at ICMM, as Blair mentioned, we spent a lot of time working with our members to develop a framework for reporting that made sense for the sector. We've worked since 2017 when we launched our water stewardship position statement with the members on consistent reporting against that. We've still seen investors wanting a different number. I want a single number that just describes water intensity, and then it's a one-size-fits-all. And I think we still have a misunderstanding that we haven't been able to shift across that last 10 years around the context, the importance of context when it comes to water. I'll talk to it probably later, but a megalitre of water in Chile is not the same as a megalitre of water on a water positive side, and so there's no one size fits all there, and so meaningful metrics, I think. But as our membership has matured along their water reporting journey, we've actually seen a shift away from disclosures now to the collaboration, the action on the ground, and that catchment scale approaches to water management, which was all part of our position statement at the beginning. Disclosures are just one part of it, but as we've seen that maturity change, we're now seeing a real focus on sustaining catchment level stewardship initiatives, and I think that's where we need to be as a sector.
Thank you, panel. That was, very complete set of answers there. In terms of corporate level visions and strategies for water-related environmental and social governance objectives, so ESG, they're often criticised if the messaging doesn't quite match the felt experience of water management outcomes on the ground, or indeed the felt experience by local stakeholders. And so it's got a suite of questions here around translating those corporate ESG visions into action. The first one for you, Travis, focusing on water. So what are some of the hallmarks of effective implementation of a corporate ESG vision? What does it look like in projects and operations, all from a stakeholder perspective?
That's awful. Okay, so look, I think it starts with at a high level doing what you say you're going to do. The ESG messages are really about trust, and so you can't say one thing and do another. And as a vision, who is it that owns that vision? It's really the board. They've set a vision that's an aspiration of where a company would like to head, and I think it's crucial that aspiration is locally meaningful, and I think to the point everyone actually has made that it can't be one size fits all, but it needs to be locally meaningful. It needs to be a program that's developed in partnership so that it is locally meaningful and resourced. And so if you as a board, if you expect change in a certain area, you need to dedicate resourcing to it. And I think importantly, you have a mechanism to evaluate whether it's doing what you think it's doing. So there's a performance reporting aspect and a verification. And I think we've all probably worked for organisations at one point where people don't like bad news, Garrick. So, you've really got to have that opportunity to say, here's, as a board, the aspiration of what we're looking to achieve, but here's the reality of what we're actually achieving. And to my point earlier, I think there needs to be a feedback loop when what we thought was going to happen perhaps didn't happen, and what are we going to do differently?
Yeah, I really like what you were talking about, locally meaningful, and that extends into a question for Emma, which you started to allude to before about the challenge of having a common metric and a common target. I wonder if you can unpack that just a wee bit more in terms of having that common metric versus the need for, I guess, a context-based or a locally based, locally meaningful target and water metric on stewardship and performance.
Thanks, Garrick. So I think we've seen this kind of almost become a bigger issue with the climate, with all the noise around climate, because we've seen with the Task Force on Climate-related financial disclosures, a single metric, and a kilogram of CO2 equivalents in Australia is the same as a kilogram of CO2 equivalents anywhere else in the world. And so that's worked really well for investors, and so they would love a similar thing in the water space. But it's just not the case when you are managing water stress, which may be water scarcity or may be too much water on a site. The response and the targets that you need to set for that are completely different. And so a water efficiency kind of target and a goal towards that in a site that's managing a water excess and needs to be moving water off their sites to return it to the environment and or for safety, completely meaningless in that sense. So that's why we would say that a context-based target makes the most sense. And a part of our good practice water reporting is that targets need to be in place for every site, and a context-based or a context-informed target is best practice, and that usually means informed by age, the local community, type of operation, all of those things that matter about how an operation interfaces with water, and measures towards that disclosed rather than a universal corporate one-size-fits-all water efficiency target as one example. And so I think that's something we haven't necessarily seen or planned, because everyone would love to be able to compare apples with apples all around the world. Water just isn't like that, as most of us in the audience are probably aware.
Thank you. Just shifting gears a little bit here, and this question for Blair and Daniel. Let's start, Daniel, with you. You're in the process of designing a new project and establishing, I guess, ESG visions and actions. And I just wanted to know a little bit more from your perspective what your experience looks like in balancing that drive for optimizing the project value or NPV of your project against the need for investment into those initiatives that are required to deliver meaningful ESG objectives.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And one of the things, so as context, Legacie is a water infrastructure developer, and we're looking primarily at the Pilbara at the moment. And as we've touched on, climate change is meaning there's increased stress on our groundwater and there's increased extremes. But on top of that, we've got the long-term demand for mining, for iron ore, lithium, other natural resources, but we've got decarbonisation and the likelihood of hydrogen, green steel manufacturing, green iron, a range of other industries that are very water intensive that are likely to come to large parts of Australia on top of that. So one of the things we've been looking at is, if we use the Pilbara as an example, BHP in isolation has huge water demand. So does Rio, so does Fortescue, so does Mineral Resources, so does Pilbara Minerals. And then we've got BP looking at hydrogen, we've got POSCO looking at green steel. So we've got regions with multiple potential water off-takers. And we've been looking at models of how do we develop a common user water infrastructure solution that might benefit multiple parties but by providing reliable water supply and taking it off balance sheet. So rather than BHP spend the CapEx and the OpEx on a water supply scheme, have a party that does it so that BHP can focus on their core business, which is mining. And in that context, we've been looking at that's giving us an opportunity to optimise the project value by having a shared infrastructure scheme. But at the same time, how do we do it in a way that values ESG and values First Nation? We've been looking at, I think the First Nations and the ESG values are really intertwined. So the Nalama people are located, they have native title and their land is where we're looking at building this desalination plant. And so from the beginning we've said, look, what does good water stewardship look like for you on your country? And they've said, don't take our groundwater. And so we're looking at a seawater desalination plant that therefore will potentially enable multiple off-takers not to abstract groundwater but to rely on a reliable source. We're looking at, obviously, green energy to supply it so that it meets those ESG goals. But we're also looking at the efficiencies of having one plant rather than multiple plants, and therefore some of the circular economy benefits of not having duplication of assets. So a lot more we can talk about that, but fundamentally, what are some of the new models that we can explore where we partner differently with First Nations, partner differently with industry and partner differently with government so that we can solve multiple problems and deliver win-win outcomes.
I'll take that off you so you don't bang me over the head when I respond to that. That's fair enough. I understand the business driver there. For someone like BHP in that sort of discussion, you know how much money we pull out of the Pilbara. And so that's what's at risk. Water's a key enabler. Most of our ore sits below the water table, so dewatering is a part of the business and part of the approvals. So we have to deal with groundwater. We've got to try and do it sustainably. And finding solutions which minimise our risk to doing business as well. So if we sort of put trust in a third party to move our water around, dewater it and help supply where we're deficit, then it's a big responsibility. So we tend to keep that in-house at the moment until there's a solution which is fairly robust, I suppose. But to your point about value, we're talking about valuing the intangibles, the things which we typically have not easy to quantify. So environment, cultural values, we all intuitively know what they are, but we've tried for decades to try and value and incorporate the value of the environment and other things into decisions we make. It's very difficult. We've come up with semi-qualitative ways and internal ways to do that, but I'll go back to a couple of comments which you made earlier on. Planning and strategy, right? So, and you can't look at water separately as a mining company. If you're looking at water and making decisions based on water alone, it's going to fail. It's got to be embedded into the mine planning process, the strategy of the business process. So it's part of decisions because there's always trade-offs to be made between water and something else. And you might defer mining below the water table somewhere because it's just going to be too expensive in terms of capital. You might want to invest it somewhere else. So all these sort of trade-offs need to be made. And in those trade-offs, you have to start thinking about the environmental elements. Now, it's difficult to put a monetary value in an NPV calculation, but you can somewhat quantify them as a narrative. And I think we get caught as an industry trying to say, oh, it's going to be worth X dollars to this environment here. I've seen those models. They're painful. They rarely work. I think we stick to the semi-qualitative discussion facts and try and use them in a narrative early in strategy. So we're making decisions based on our strategic drivers, input from third parties and communities, Indigenous and traditional owners.
So the integration of more sustainable water management practices into project design can sometimes require innovative solutions. And some of those solutions might be first of a kind or perhaps not trialled in that catchment or that operating environment. And so I have a question starting with you, Travis. From your perspective, when it comes to integrating some innovative or some sustainable solutions into a project, from your perspective, what steps can be taken to reduce the uncertainties in the project planning, the solution execution, or even regulation and outcomes in the field?
Start off by saying certainly encourage innovation. Like we all want to see innovation. And there are no certainties in life, much less in water. So it's about how do you reduce it. And I guess if you're starting, something new, probably start small would be the first thing. We don't want to be piloting something that's, never been done before on a grand scale for the first time. Start small, fail fast, learn early, and adapt. But I think from a regulatory perspective, it's about outcomes and having contingencies if those outcomes are at risk. And I think everyone understands there is uncertainty, but you can't then put that back on the government to accept that risk. The proponent or the industry, the mine industry accepts that risk. And I think it's important to be transparent about that up front. Transparent with government, also with stakeholders, so that, it might be 80% certain that, the shallow aquifer is not connected to the deep aquifer, and therefore when you dewater, you're not going to impact on a creek, and then you start doing it and you find that's not the case. But you need to be transparent about that up front. So I think having transparency, having contingencies identified and agreed up front, with those two things in place, I think the environment is right for innovation, because we can't keep doing what we've always done.
Can I add to that. Before I joined ICMM, I was in the Queensland government, so I understand the regulator's perspective around risk and the risk-averse nature of legislation. That's what the Environment Department is for. But I have seen examples in other jurisdictions that don't ignore the risk but allow for some innovation a little bit more flexibly than some other parts of the world. And one example that I would like to point out would be in Ontario. I've heard the limited operational flexibility permits they have there that allow specifically for water, within a 3-year window, a chance for a new technology to be tried or something new to be done for a period of up to 3 years, and that can be extended twice if I understand the ledge correctly. As long as there are some measures in place, a bit of a backstop, but it doesn't have to be proven. It doesn't need to have every T crossed or I dotted before the regulator changes their permit, and they don't have to front load and go through a permit variation beforehand. They've got a really quick mechanism in their ledge to allow for that innovation and that attempt to try something new, as long as there's some kind of safeguard in place. And I like that approach of a bit more shared risk. The regulator's willing to be a little bit flexible with a defined time frame to encourage innovation rather than require a massive amount of paperwork before we even try. So, I mean, there are models that could be explored in other places as well to support that innovation.
Thank you. Blair, just leveraging off that question, internally within a mining company, how are you, I guess, managing and also messaging the uncertainties associated with some of these water management solutions? For example, you took managed aquifer recharge to the Pilbara. And there would have been a degree of technical uncertainty associated with that. Can you talk us through perhaps some of the approaches you may have taken in terms of managing those internally?
Yeah, we've learnt the hard way that natural variability matters and that you can't predict with a level of confidence what you do with water on a regional scale, even local. And please, that's quite a serious discussion on that point, because we've done our analysis in the past 20 years of our numerical models and predictive analysis, and I have very low confidence in modelling generally. It's the way we use modelling and how we then explain the results is where we've got to shift as an industry. And BHP and Rio and some other mining companies have got together with research organisations to try and quantify probabilities of an unacceptable event occurring. And that's moving pretty well, but it still demonstrates there's a big range of plausible outcomes. And if you pretend you can predict a metre drawdown at a spring, a kilometre or 10 kilometres away, you're dreaming. And so I think the industry needs to wake up a little bit to that and think through, well, I think some of the commentary was along these lines, is accept the uncertainty, embrace it, realise it could be a whole range of outcomes, and focus your attention then, instead of trying to grind down numerical models and come really predictive and give you this false sense of security, you sort of should be focusing your attention on what are the controls at work. So what's the impact that could occur? That spring could go down. If it goes down, what would I do? Then how do I test that to make sure that won't happen? So in energy, before you get approvals, or as part of your approval process, is to demonstrate your mitigating and preventative controls are effective, more than trying to demonstrate and convince people you got the numerical grunt to get somewhere. And so I think adopting uncertainty to its full extent and building that into your mitigating controls, I think is a fair and reasonable approach that the mining company should be adopting. Yep.
Thank you, Blair. Daniel, what are some examples of good stakeholder inclusion and collaboration and partnerships for integration of water stewardship solutions into your project design?
Thanks, Blair. I think that, I touched on some of them before, and I think we need to look at water holistically and say, look, it's not either or, all seawater desalination or all groundwater extraction. But use an example of BHP. At the moment, they use 10 gigalitres per year at Port Hedland for dust suppression, which Water Corp's supplying them, and we're talking to them about taking that off, using the seawater desalination plant for that. So Water Corp's supply is freed up for township supply, and BHP doesn't need to extract groundwater for dust suppression. So you've got to look at holistically and go, well, what's the use of the water? Yes, we need to de-water for mining, but we don't need to use groundwater for all of our supply at sites. And similarly, engaging early to understand, as I said, with the Nalma people, what does good look like for them, and how do we deliver win-win outcomes? And I touched on the environmental side with Nalma. but also the model of what does intergenerational wealth look like for our First Nations partners. So on some of these sites, we're making, if you look at the Pilbara and the amount the Australian economy makes out of mining, it's fantastic, and we're incredibly blessed to have such rich resources. How do we help close the gap for our First Nations communities? And interestingly enough, so many of those communities are located in industrial mining parts of Australia. And so the model we're looking at has equity, free carry equity for Ngalama, enhanced ILUA, and a seat on the board. So they actually have a voice throughout the development of a project, as opposed to being negotiated with and then given a solution. So from the very beginning, asking questions, listening, learning, and then trying to go on a journey of co-development, which delivers positive outcomes for the First Nations community, positive outcomes for industry, and positive outcomes for government. And we do have gaps. Like if we look at WA, it's quite unique where we've got strategic industrial areas and no infrastructure provided. So mining companies, hydrogen producers, industries expected to fill those gaps, and therefore it allows innovation and it enables. But we as an industry and as developers need to come together and say, how do we help bring water to these sites quickly to unlock decarbonisation projects? How do we bring energy? And those common user infrastructure solutions are potentially part of that solution.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so these are some questions or a theme for the entire panel. You'll be first to the microphone to answer. But I want to explore some lessons learned. And so we've all seen some unintended consequences of water management decisions and projects and operations, impacting not just the project, but also environment, cultural, and social values as well. So, for the panel, in your experience, what processes or oversights have led to these outcomes, and how can impacts be avoided or reduced in the future? And some examples of that.
I'm going to go first because Blair mentioned my least favourite acronym at all, which was NPV. So net present value. And I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned as an industry, and we're probably still learning, and maybe the right people aren't necessarily learning it, is that water treatment in perpetuity isn't actually cheaper than doing something differently 20, 30, 40 years earlier, though net present value kind of accounting forces those decisions that mean we are left with often closure decisions that result in water treatment in perpetuity. And regulatory limits are going to continue to be tightened in the future. And so the costs associated with continuing water treatment in perpetuity are a lesson that I think we need to be incorporating much earlier into our decision making and thinking about planning in ways that don't just fall back on NPV. When I can think about that as a general lesson and some of the ways we've responded to that, probably I could see stakeholder inclusive responses. But ideally, it would have been better to design out water treatment in perpetuity. That's the lesson I think we need to learn. But I know there are some examples from across our membership where we've seen, for example, tech in Elk Valley really partnering with the government to just own the water treatment issues there and making it a shared solution going forward. The decisions were made 40 years ago. We're in the situation we're in now. What can we do together? We've seen similar with the Athabasca working group where with uranium mining happening there, and I think community-based monitoring, citizen science, etc., to see transparency around water quality in catchments. So it's kind of like shared ownership of the situation that we find ourselves in now. But the lesson being, we need better ways of valuing, I guess, not just water, but the actions that are taken on a site through life of assets, so that we don't see water challenges presenting at closure.
Thank you, Emma. Anyone else? Travis, go for it.
Happy to go. Look, I think we've touched on it. I think there's probably two broad categories. One is inevitably there's uncertainty, and sometimes what you think is going to happen just doesn't happen. And so you think you're not going to impact on a environmental value, and then for whatever reason you do, and that's life. And I think that's why we need to have good contingency planning. I think the other point, and Emma touched on it, is the mining industry has been around for a long while. We've come a long way, and didn't always ask or identify what the right cultural or environmental values were. And I think about some examples where it was almost a surprise, after 40 years of operation, I didn't even know that was there. So I think industry has come a long way, but there's a massive legacy that needs to be dealt with and recognised, and I think we've got a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. There's a couple of things I would add. Assurance. We all got to be held accountable for the decisions we make. So each of the mining companies have got to have robust governance and assurance models. It's got to have a level of independence. We've learnt the hard way, as you probably know, recent media articles. So I think there's a need for transparency on what we do, with assurance on that and some level of governance around it. Because if we don't do that, we're going to be exposed to making rash decisions. And just going back to the point around our lessons about engagement, we've been turned on our head globally in the last 2 to 5 years. So what we saw in the Pilbara with Duke and Gorge, that's not unusual, right? So I look across all our portfolio. I see it in the States, I see it in Canada, I see it in Chile, I see it in Australia. The same theme is that we need to do a better job at engaging early with traditional owners and other stakeholders. And it's not just one way, it's give the time for them to soak it and getting the feedback into our designs. That doesn't fit our schedules. We're on a mission to pump ore out of the Pilbara or in Escondida, and these two things are clashing. And it's, at the moment, I think we're going through that teething stage of just realising that we have to find a better way, because there's a limited amount of engagement we can have with some of these traditional owners, for example. And so we have to find better ways to build trust, because once you've built trust, you can then start moving forward, but you can erode that trust really quickly.
I just want to pick up on that point, and once again, a question for the panel. In the wake of such an impact to, say, environmental and cultural values, what might be some useful approaches to stakeholder consultation and inclusion in the implementation of the solution or the design of the solution to that impact?
I think we're talking a bit about that evolution. I think the resources industry has come a huge way, a long way, and there's been so much change in how we engage. I think there are different models. Obviously, with the model that I've already touched on with Nalama Water, the engaging right from the beginning and having the First Nations community as a partner in the project has actually made them an advocate. So Nalama Aboriginal corporations out there saying, we want to off-takers on their land saying we'd prefer you use this project because of the environmental benefits to our land, because we obviously share in some of the financial benefits as well as a people group. So what are models where we can have a genuine partnership and genuine trust from the beginning is something that I think is a huge opportunity for us. But also, what are those mechanisms to give them a voice? And I mentioned that having a seat on the board and seat on the steering committees, because they're involved in the decision making, we've seen the cultural and heritage approval process occur faster than we think it's occurred on any project in the Pilbara's history, because they see the benefits and they've been very pragmatic and practical about where to develop on their site. So I think through partnerships we can see a lot of benefits in actually streamlined, fast-tracked approvals, and the Nalama Water project is projected to, if it develops, happen in 5 years, and Water Corp saying their scheme would take 10 years. So we can potentially partner and achieve faster approvals and therefore water more quickly to unlock industry.
I mentioned earlier that Athabasca working group in Saskatchewan in the uranium mining area, and I think that's a really good example. It's quite a number of years old now. I think it was established in the 90s, but one example of the mining industry needing to be vulnerable but bringing stakeholders into the solution afterwards. And so there they have a participatory monitoring program, and the companies have completely relinquished monitoring of their water to an independent third party and to the community to allow that transparency and to build trust in the data. Because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, we've fixed your water pollution, just believe us, here's our numbers. It's another to have the community involved in the sampling and seeing the data and having it verified by a party that has no skin in the game. And I think that's a really interesting way of stakeholder inclusive response to some of our water challenges.
You got more? No? Oh.
Garrick, if I can just add one point
Please,
on that.
yeah,
I think it's important, when things don't go right, that you admit that there's a problem, you acknowledge it, understand what contributed to it, but then you really listen on what the solution should be. And I experienced, this I suppose an unintended impact to various groundwater springs in the Pilbara, and the solution looked very different depending on the traditional owner group that was, whose country it was on. And, one was really looking for an immediate reinstatement and was holding, the resources industry to account on that. And the other was concerned about cultural contamination and wanted it to naturally remediate. And I think if there wasn't good listening around that, you would just jump to, oh, there's a problem, let's fix it. Absolutely, it's not
a cookie cutter approach. Every First Nations group's different, and we need to engage with them and listen to them for their own unique perspectives.
Fantastic example, and I remember that. As an industry, the approach was to, well, let's get it back to the way it was. That wasn't actually what the traditional owners wanted to see happen in that specific instance. They were more interested in the natural recovery of the impact. Yeah, fantastic. Look, shifting now, I guess, to that question of water stewardship and closure. And Blair, you're the practice lead for water management and mine closure at BHP. And can you share what you have found, I guess, most critical in translating that vision for mine closure and the realities for water stewardship and what that looks like? I guess both at a corporate level and also at a project or an operational level.
Wow, it's a big question. It's a hard one too. So I inherited in my team closure as well as water, and that's because of the synergies were pretty natural. We've got around about 20, maybe 24 sites which are somewhat closed or closing. Majority of them have got water-related issues. Majority of them are old, hundreds of years old in some cases, with tailings dams. During the establishment of these facilities, it was never thought through what they're going to look like at the end. As the industry wants to move towards metals, copper, this is typically sulfide material. It's going to be reactive. If you're mining sulfides in the rainfall environment over a couple of 100 millimetres per year, you're going to get acidity. You're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to plan that at an early stage into your designs. You're going to have to work out where you place your waste material, co-locate it, how you line it and how you close it, separate the materials, right back to the geological model. So the geological model is the place you start to characterise material. So once it gets out of the ground, you've got destinations for that material and you've characterised your waste. But the jumping to closure too early is also a mistake, and I see that a lot. There's a lot of sexy solutions out there. We want to put solar panels or put a BMX track on top of a tailings dam or something like that, or a flying fox across the lake or something, which are all good solutions, but that's the closure objective at the end. Nice to have them, but you got to have your knowledge base. You got to know what your risks are, and to do that, you need to know your physicals and non-physicals. Physicals, your geochemistry and your erosion and pit lake material qualities. Your non-physicals knowledge bases, they're all the people you got to deal with, the regulators. That's a knowledge base. You've got to understand those, and they've all got to come together to inform the decisions and plans you make. So doing that during operations, so you're planning for closure. So when you go into the closure and you're in that closure stage, you've already got most of that thought process done, so you can start to optimise your designs. If you start working to closure at the end of the mining, look at Ranger. I think we've all seen the costs on that. I think they tripled or quadrupled, I can't remember, as the knowledge base increased and all the uncertainties came out, all the things we wanted and wished for, which hope's not a strategy. If we wait to the end to get some hope, we're going nowhere. So I think that early stage knowledge base, understand your risks, make sure you understand your uncertainties, build that into your plans, and again, be adaptive, and then start to think through what it looks like at the end of the day with your flying foxes and etc.
Great answer. Thank you very much, Blair. A question for you, Emma, around, I guess, what steps can the industry take to ensure that water stewardship is embedded and sustained after we move on? And by we, I mean the operator or the regulator, or indeed the industry after we move on from that project.
I love this question because I think water and closure are two sides of the same coin. So Garrick introduced the definition of water stewardship earlier being around economic, social and environmental benefits, all of them, balancing those three. The goal of good integrated mine closure is to balance the financial, environmental and social outcomes and leave a positive legacy across all those three. So they're two sides of the same coin. So I think the best thing we can be doing to ensure that our water interventions last in perpetuity is to be considering closure into our water stewardship from day zero, from the beginning. Earlier this year, ICMM published a water stewardship maturity framework to support companies on their journey if they want to embed water stewardship into their day-to-day. It's a bit of a framework on how to do that, a very practical tool with an Excel sheet across 23 subcategories of what water stewardship looks like in practice for our industry and how they can progress kind of from basic to advanced to leading practice there. So a really lovely roadmap. But in each of those sections, there's a call out to cross-functional linkages for the water practitioner trying to embed this into their organisation. And closure is one of those call outs in many of the subsections there. It does have its own section as well. It's a dedicated area thinking about water in closure, but it's too late to leave it until the closure phase. So it's really considering closure at all of those stages in your water stewardship journey. And I would encourage you to download the tool and interface with it if you'd like to see what that looks like in practice. But I can think some very practical examples of sustaining our water stewardship interventions after we've gone. And a lot of it comes back to co-financing and co-delivering those during the operation. So not coming in and parachuting a great solution and then hoping it lasts after, but having that co-delivery throughout. So if I think of one example in the Choapa region of Chile, Antofagasta liaised there with their local stakeholders at what their water needs were, and they were related to basic access to water and sanitation services. And Antofagasta provided digital automation solutions for their rural sanitary services, worked with the government to deliver that, built capacity in the community to monitor those. So it wasn't like we came in and just solved the solution and hoped it would last. From the beginning, it was co-delivered and co-designed, and the need actually originated from them. So it wasn't us, it wasn't the company deciding what they thought would work there. It originated with them. So kind of a shared ownership from the beginning is probably, I think, the most common success factor, I would say, for ensuring our interventions last.
Thank you very much. Look, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing such deep insights and experience hard won, I think. But before we wrap up, I would like to invite each of our panelists to offer one final summary, comment, a key takeaway, or a call to action for the room here on water stewardship and sustainable water management in the mining industry. Let's start with Blair, or move down.
One comment. All right. Do not look at water as its own entity. It's a part of the total decisions you got to make. It's one aspect of it. We have these water management plans, water engagement strategies. Yeah, they're to inform decisions we got to make, which are more broader than water. They've got to dovetail into community engagement plans. They've got to dovetail into traditional owner plans. They've got to dovetail into mine plans. They've got to dovetail into tailings plans. They've got to dovetail into geotechnical plans, because all those things, water is material, input, and enabler to.
Probably the thing I'd add to that is how do we... I think we're uniquely placed in Australia where a lot of our industry is located in similar locations to remote communities who are struggling with water and sanitation services and public health. And so I think that my call to action is how do we develop models where we continue to both deliver economic outcomes through industry, but also deliver social and environmental and cultural outcomes for remote communities in those areas as well.
Well, firstly, thanks everyone for giving up your lunch break. I can see everyone's ready to go. But look, great discussion. Thanks everyone. My call to action is just to reinforce water is life. And so today's exceptional is tomorrow's standard. And we really need to continue to push ourselves to innovate and challenge around what we can achieve in this space as it is integrated into the rest of the issues that we're dealing with. Thanks so much.
I'll say again, water and closure are inseparable. The two sides of the same coin. Don't leave it till closure to start thinking about closure, because your closure challenges will present as water challenges. So talk now.
Thank you very much, everybody. Look, as a show of thanks, can we give all of our panelists a warm round of applause for their generous contribution during this session? Very much appreciated.